The edge of the impossible. Imagine a night so still it feels like the world has stopped breathing. No wind, no movement, just the low, distant murmur of artillery far beyond the horizon, like a storm that never fully arrives. Between two exhausted armies lies a stretch of land they no longer call no man's land. Now they call it something else. They call it the Labyrinth. Nearly 2 miles wide, it isn't just a minefield. It is layers of minefields stacked in depth like rings of an invisible fortress. Pressure mines, tripwires, anti-tank charges buried beneath fake rocks, booby-trapped craters. Even the corpses left on the surface may hide a final murderous surprise. For months, every attempt to cross it has ended the same way, with smoke, blood, and silence. The war has stalled here. On one side, a battered coalition, tired, undersupplied, but clinging to this last defensive line. On the other, a mechanized army poised for a decisive blow, waiting only for a path through the mines to unleash its armored spearhead. High Command knows the truth. Whoever controls the far side of the Labyrinth will control the road network behind it. And whoever controls those roads controls the rest of the campaign. But right now, no one controls anything, because no one can get through. The front has frozen into a deadlock. Artillery duels come and go. Recon patrols vanish. Engineers who try to probe the minefield do not come back. And as the weeks turn into months, the war slowly bleeds into a stalemate that neither side can afford. Inside a dimly lit command dugout, maps cover the walls. Red and blue arrows, drawn and erased again. The air smells of damp earth, tobacco smoke, and defeat. At the center of this cramped nerve center stands Colonel Arthur Hale. He's not the highest-ranking officer at the front, but he's the one they call when the situation stops making sense. He stares at the Labyrinth as it is sketched on a map, nothing but ink and symbols. He knows the reality is worse. Dozens of reconnaissance photos lie scattered on the table, rows of dragon's teeth, barbed wire, scorched earth. Beyond them, faint hints of buried patterns, slight discolorations, regular spacing, disturbed soil. The enemy didn't just lay mines. They designed this field as a psychological weapon. Every failed attempt to cross has been carefully watched. Every path probed and mapped. Every dead sapper added to a growing, invisible database of what the enemy is willing to try. Now the defenders know their opponent's habits. They know how engineers think. They know where they like to test, where they try to cut gaps, where they send their armored columns once a breach is cleared. The Labyrinth has become more than a barrier. It has become a trap for predictability itself. Hale's orders are brutally simple. Find a way through, or this front collapses. He gathers his staff, intelligence officers, engineers, communication specialists, a handful of field commanders seasoned enough to recognize a doomed plan when they see one. On the wall behind him, someone has written a phrase in chalk. There is no way around. There is no way over, only through. Hale doesn't erase it. He knows the enemy expects the usual solutions: careful probing, slow clearance, armored push behind a narrow, meticulously cleared lane. They've seen it all before. So, Hale understands the horrifying implication. If the enemy expects every logical approach, then the only winning move may be something that doesn't look logical at all. That's when he calls in Captain Elias Ward. Ward is an engineer by rank, but the men call him the Tinkerer. He has a reputation for turning scrap metal into working equipment, for finding loopholes in physics and doctrine alike. He's the one who once built a mobile bridge from abandoned fuel drums and spare track segments. the one who rerouted a flooded river into the enemy trenches using nothing but shovels, pipes, and rage. He walks into the command dugout with mud still on his boots and a rolled-up notebook under his arm. "Sir," he says. Hale points to the map. "We need a path through that," the colonel states quietly. "The enemy has fortified it for months. They predicted our every move." He pauses. "So we need something they cannot predict, something they would never even consider." Ward studies the map in silence. His eyes move slowly over the shaded area marking the Labyrinth. He knows the reports. He's read the casualty lists. He remembers the names. He also knows one more thing. The men expect this problem to be unsolvable. In the trenches outside, soldiers whisper about the minefield as if it were alive. They talk about ghosts wandering inside it, about lost patrols whose screams echo on certain nights. Superstition has fused with reality. The Labyrinth isn't just steel and TNT anymore. It's become an idea that says, "Here you will die." Hale watches Ward closely. "Captain," he says, "what if we don't have weeks to clear paths? What if we don't have the luxury of methodical work? What if the only way to survive is to cross it in a single night?" Ward looks up. "A full crossing, with infantry and armor?" he asks. "Yes," Hale replies. "A strike force large enough to punch through and hold the far side before dawn. We have one chance. One." He taps the map with a finger. "If we can pull off the impossible here, we break the stalemate. If we fail—" He doesn't need to finish. Ward exhales slowly. Crossing a layered minefield in one night is not a plan. It's a death sentence, on paper. But in this war, paper means very little. He unrolls his notebook on the table. Inside are sketches, odd vehicles, modified rollers, wiring diagrams, strange clustered shapes labeled with hastily scrawled notes. These are not standard textbook solutions. These are experiments. Half-mad ideas born in trenches and workshops under fire. What if, Ward begins carefully, we stop thinking of the minefield as something to remove and instead think of it as something to root around, inside itself? The officers exchange glances. The phrase makes no sense. Yet. Ward points at the map. "They laid this field to predict our movement, to force us onto narrow, obvious corridors. But if we can find a way to move across it in a pattern they never anticipated, we can go where their densities are weakest, where their kill zones do not overlap." Hale narrows his eyes. "And how," he asks, "do you propose we do that, Captain? Divining rods and blind faith?" Ward shakes his head. "No, sir. We'll use their own logic against them, their habits, their doctrine, their overconfidence. We'll make the minefield lie to them." The room falls silent. Outside, the front remains locked in its deadly stillness. But inside this cramped dugout, the war is about to shift. Because in that moment, the seed of an insane idea takes root. A maneuver not about clearing every mine, but about dancing between them. An impossible crossing that no enemy planner has accounted for. A single, suicidal gamble that just might change history. Beat? What follows is the story of how that gamble became real. How a handful of engineers, sappers, and soldiers stepped into the Labyrinth and turned an impassable minefield into a pathway no one believed could exist. Designing the impossible. To understand how the impossible became possible, we have to go inside the mind of Captain Elias Ward. He starts not with explosives, not with blueprints, but with a question. If I were them, where would I never expect an attack? The enemy's doctrine is thorough, methodical, ruthless. They believe in depth, redundancy, overlapping arcs of fire. Their minefields are not random. They are carefully crafted to corral any attacker into predictable funnels, kill zones pre-registered for artillery and machine guns. Ward knows this because he's studied their previous defenses. And he's noticed something. The enemy trusts in patterns. They create belts of dense mines, then leave slightly thinner areas, not safe, not by any means, but less saturated, where they assume no sane commander would direct a main assault. Why? Because those areas are still lethal. Just a little less. Enough, perhaps, for a madman. Ward spends long nights with aerial photographs, translating shadows and soil disturbances into probability maps. With his team of engineers, he starts to sketch possible veins of slightly reduced density, routes that zigzag and curve, avoiding the thickest clusters. It's not a path in the traditional sense. It's a pattern of survival. But patterns alone won't save anyone. He needs a way to move troops and vehicles through those narrow, twisting channels fast, before the enemy realizes what's happening. That's where the machines come in. Ward gathers every damaged vehicle, every wrecked chassis, every spare length of steel they can scavenge. In a ramshackle depot behind the lines, torches spark and hammers ring late into the night. They build 3 types of tools. First, cradle rollers. Heavy, crude assemblies mounted on sacrificial frames, designed to pre-detonate pressure mines ahead of a vehicle, but only in a narrow track. Each blast may destroy a roller, but that's the point. The machine dies so the column behind it can live. Second, spider sleds. Low skeletal frames dragged ahead by cables, covered in hooks and weighted chains. Their job is to snag tripwires and command-detonated leads before men's boots do. If something goes off, it happens 20, 30 yards ahead. Third, a series of small, ugly boxes wired together in strange configurations. The soldiers call them heartbeat decoys. These devices emit irregular pulses of noise, heat, and electromagnetic signatures scattered along the flanks of the intended route. They are designed to confuse, to trigger, to make the minefield wake up where no one is actually crossing. If there are hidden observers, human or mechanical, watching for movement, they won't know where the real threat is. But Ward's most radical idea isn't mechanical. It's tactical. He proposes that the crossing will not begin with sappers creeping forward cautiously. Instead, the operation will start with something that sounds like madness, a feigned failure. Before the real assault, a small, expendable detachment will probe the minefield at a completely different point, loudly, visibly, predictably. They'll use textbook tactics. They'll clear lanes, mark them with white tape, bring up a few vehicles. Then disaster will strike. A deliberate detonation, a staged breakdown. Radio traffic filled with panic. The enemy, watching, will conclude exactly what Ward wants them to conclude. The fools are trying the obvious route again. Let them die. Meanwhile, under cover of this drama, the true operation will be forming miles away, hidden under camouflage nets and radio silence. Hale listens to the proposal, his face unreadable. "You're asking me," he says slowly, "to sacrifice men to sell a lie." Ward doesn't flinch. "I'm asking you to save thousands by risking dozens," he replies. The enemy expects caution. We give them careless aggression, on purpose. While they're focused on the noise, we move in the shadows. The colonel's jaw tightens. He's seen enough war to know that there are no clean choices left. Approval comes in the form of a signature on a single sheet of paper. The operation receives a code name whispered more than spoken. Labyrinth Run. In the days that follow, a select group of units is pulled quietly from the line. Sappers, engineers, radio operators, veteran infantry squads, tank crews with steady nerves. They disappear into a training area far behind the front, fenced off, guarded night and day. There, in a mocked-up minefield built from captured enemy designs, Ward and his team drill them relentlessly. They learn to move in measured steps, counting silently. They learn to trust the rhythm of the rollers and sleds to follow precisely in their wake. They practice nighttime movement with blacked-out goggles. They rehearse alternate routes, backup signals, emergency withdrawal patterns. No one outside the perimeter knows what they're doing. Rumors spread. A punishment unit, a secret weapon, a doomed experiment. In a way, all three are true. Ward walks the lanes at night, clipboard in hand, listening to the clank of chains and the distant thud of controlled detonations. Every misstep, every mistake, he logs and adjusts for. A roller destroyed too quickly? Reinforce the axle. A sled missing tripwires at a certain height? Add hook extensions? Troops bunching up? Redesign the spacing markers. Bit by bit, the chaos becomes choreography. On the final night of training, Hale visits the site. From a small observation tower, he watches as the entire drill force conducts a full rehearsal of the run. In darkness lit only by occasional flares, the column emerges, ghostly shapes moving in practiced silence. Rollers thunder, sleds scrape. The infantry advances behind them, heads low, eyes locked on the path. Controlled charges erupt ahead, sending shock waves of dust into the air. But the line does not break. Each small explosion is part of the pattern, a sacrifice the plan has already accounted for. When the drill ends, Hale descends from the tower. He finds Ward standing alone, hands blackened with grease, eyes rimmed with fatigue. "Will it work?" the colonel asks. Ward doesn't pretend certainty. "It will work," he says quietly, "if the enemy believes the first lie, if they watch the wrong place at the right time, and if every man out there steps exactly where he's supposed to." Hale nods once. "Then we give them the lie," he replies. The date is set. The units receive sealed orders, maps are memorized, then burned. And somewhere, deep beneath the earth, the Labyrinth waits, silent, patient, convinced that it has seen every possible human mistake. It has no idea what's coming. Through the Labyrinth. The night chosen for Labyrinth Run arrives with a heavy, low sky, no stars, no moon, just a uniform darkness that feels less like absence of light and more like a physical weight pressing down on the world. At 21 hours, Phase 1 begins. Far from the true crossing point, the sacrificial detachment moves forward in full view of enemy observation lines. Searchlights sweep, flares pop, artillery wakes up. From their vantage points, enemy officers watch a familiar scene unfold. Engineers advancing cautiously, explosive charges being set to blow gaps in wire, white tapes unrolled to mark cleared lanes. Then the expected chaos. An explosion too close, men falling, shouted orders, vehicles grinding to a halt. It looks like a failed, desperate attempt at a breach. Exactly as Ward intended. Radio traffic bursts into the ether, some of it real, some of it fabricated. Reports of heavy losses, confusion, requests for retreat. The enemy, listening in, hears what they're conditioned to hear. Another clumsy assault, another failure, nothing new. They shift artillery, tighten their focus on this noisy sector, prepare to finish the job. And in doing so, they turn their attention away from the place that really matters. At 2340 hours, 15 kilometers down the line, the true crossing begins. The first sound is a low metallic rattle as the cradle rollers start to move. In a shallow depression masked by camouflage nets, the Labyrinth run column emerges like a creature waking from sleep. At the very front, the lead roller vehicle lurches forward, its armored hull already scarred from training. Behind it, spider sleds drag along on cables, their hooked frames ready to catch any hidden wire. Then comes the infantry, small squads spaced with mathematical precision, each man trained to place his boots exactly where the one before him stepped. On the flanks, teams carry the heartbeat decoys, ready to plant them in pre-marked positions. There are no shouted orders now, only hand signals, only the quiet crackle of short-range radios held close to lips. The moment they crest the last fold of ground before the Labyrinth, the air seems to change. The noise of distant artillery falls away. Even the night insects are gone. The minefield doesn't look like much from here, just scarred earth, scattered debris, twisted wire. But those who have studied the maps know every patch of seemingly empty soil could kill. Ward walks a few paces behind the lead roller, headset on, eyes flicking between the ground and the faint glow of his wristwatch. "Forward," he murmurs. "Maintain speed, no abrupt stops." The roller crawls into the Labyrinth. For a moment, nothing happens. Then, a dull, heavy whump. The front left section of the roller erupts in a burst of dirt and flame. Shrapnel hammers against the hull. The vehicle shudders but does not die. The sacrificial segment has done its job, absorbing the blast of a buried mine. Behind it, no one breaks stride. The infantry's boots land where the now destroyed roller track has passed. The gamble has begun. They move in a strange, almost hypnotic pattern. The path is not straight. It weaves, curves, doubles back subtly, following the invisible channels Ward's team mapped from photographs and probability charts. From above, if anyone could see it, the formation would look less like a military column and more like a line of ink threading through the twisted veins of a leaf. Every few minutes, another explosion. Sometimes it's a pressure mine triggered by a roller. Sometimes a tripwire snagged by a spider sled. Each blast throws men to the ground, ears ringing, hearts pounding. But the training holds. They get back up. They keep moving. On the flanks, the decoy teams work quickly, setting their strange, humming boxes in clusters among twisted metal and old shell holes. Soon the minefield is alive with false signatures, heat pulses, erratic noises, disturbances that suggest movement where there is none. If the enemy uses any form of seismic or thermal detection, their screens will now be cluttered with ghosts. Half an hour into the crossing, trouble hits. The second roller vehicle reports structural damage. Too many hits. Its frame is starting to warp. Ward has planned for this. He calls for shed and shift. At his signal, the damaged roller deliberately drives onto a suspected dense patch, sacrificing itself in a controlled detonation. The blast tears it apart, but in doing so, it clears a new crater and exposes several buried charges. Sappers rush forward, probes in hand, working with ruthless efficiency. They neutralize what they can, mark what they can't, and in minutes, the column is rerouted a few meters to the left, still within the safety of its invisible corridor. The men are sweating despite the cold, not from exertion, but from terror. Every step feels like it might be the last. Every soft crunch of soil could be the prelude to oblivion. But the path holds. At predetermined checkpoints, Ward checks in with Hale via low-power, encrypted bursts. "Checkpoint 3 reached," he whispers. "Losses within acceptable range. Proceeding." On the far side of the line in the command dugout, Hale listens with a tensed jaw. He knows what acceptable range means. It means men already dead or maimed in service of the plan. But compared to the slaughter of a conventional assault, it is less. And less is the closest thing to mercy this battlefield has left. As the column nears the midpoint of the minefield, the first enemy reaction arrives. Long-range artillery begins to fall, not precisely on the route, but close enough to send fountains of earth into the air. The enemy has noticed something unusual, but between the decoys and the false assault still raging far away, they haven't yet grasped the scale. Ward orders a brief pause under the cover of a shallow depression. Men flatten themselves against the ground as shells howl overhead. Shrapnel rattles off armor. One of the Spider sled crews doesn't get down quickly enough. When the barrage lifts, two of them don't get up. Ward doesn't have the luxury of grief. Their sled is dragged forward by a replacement team. The formation tightens, then begins to move again. They are deep in the labyrinth now, too far to retreat. The only way out is through. Finally, after what feels like hours compressed into minutes, the lead elements see it. The faint rise of ground that marks the far edge of the minefield. Beyond it, the enemy's rear defensive line. Artillery batteries, supply convoys. Reserve troops who still believe they are safe behind an impenetrable shield. Ward speaks 3 words into his headset. Phase 2. Now. From hidden positions behind the friendly line, artillery that has kept silent all night suddenly opens up, not on the minefield, but beyond it. Shells rain down on enemy communication hubs, known observation posts, and suspected command centers. The timing is brutal, surgical. At the same moment, the front ranks of the Labyrinth-run column crest the final rise. They burst out of the minefield like ghosts stepping through a wall. For a brief, surreal instant, the enemy soldiers on the far side simply stare. They are looking at the impossible. Then, the real battle begins. When the impossible becomes real. The first shots at the far side of the labyrinth don't come from artillery. They come from startled riflemen and machine gunners who can't quite believe what they're seeing. Enemy troops emerging from the minefield itself, as if the earth had decided to betray them. But disbelief does not stop bullets. The leading infantry squads of Labyrinth Run dive for cover behind overturned supply trucks and low revetments. They return fire in short, controlled bursts. No wild heroics, no wasted ammunition. Behind them, tanks heave themselves up out of the minefield's final ridge, their tracks following the narrow corridor etched into the earth by destroyed rollers and cleared sled paths. These are not heavy assault behemoths. Ward chose lighter, more agile vehicles, less protection, but faster, better able to maneuver in the cramped chaos of the enemy rear. Their turrets swing as one. They open fire. Shells slam into ammunition dumps, parked vehicles, and hastily manned gun positions. The effect is immediate and devastating. The enemy rear area was built on the assumption that the minefield made it untouchable. Artillery pieces are set up for comfort, not survival. Supply caches are stacked in the open. Barracks sit without overhead cover. Now all of it is exposed. As the first fires begin to spread, Ward pushes forward, establishing a makeshift command post behind a shattered stone wall. He knows the window of opportunity is narrow. The minefield they just crossed still lies between them and their own main force. Reinforcements will take time. For the moment, the Labyrinth-run units are a spear thrust deep into enemy flesh, sharp but thin. They must hit hard enough, fast enough, that the wound can't be easily closed. Hale, back at headquarters, monitors the incoming reports. Maps are updated in frantic pencil strokes as more and more positions fall into the contested or captured categories. Enemy artillery batteries go silent one by one, overrun by infantry, or forced to abandon their guns under tank fire. Communication lines crackle with panic. Intercepted messages reveal confusion and disbelief at higher echelons. Breakthrough from where? How did they get past the mines? Is this a local penetration or a full-scale assault? The enemy's greatest advantage, confidence in their impregnable barrier, has just flipped into their greatest weakness. They have no contingency plan for this. Their reserves are positioned to counter an attack through predictable, previously mapped breach lanes. Now they must scramble, redeploying units in real time across roads suddenly threatened by enemy patrols emerging from impossible directions. Ward's men exploit every second. Small teams fan out to key junctions and signal posts. They sabotage radio masts, cut field telephone lines, and plant demolition charges on bridges the enemy might use to bring reinforcements. One squad seizes an unguarded observation tower and turns it into a spotter nest for friendly artillery, which now begins to range deeper into the enemy rear than ever before. The labyrinth has been flipped. What was once a shield is now a wall for the enemy. Their units rushing to plug the gap find themselves forced to detour around their own minefield, losing precious time, bunching up on limited roads now under fire. By dawn, the battlefield has changed shape. A wedge of territory behind the enemy's former safe line is now under contested control. Though small on the map, its impact is enormous. Deprived of secure logistics routes, enemy frontline units begin to feel the strain. Ammunition shipments are delayed or destroyed. Fuel runs short. Medical evacuation becomes a nightmare as ambulances must choose between braving the now compromised minefield perimeter or taking long exposed detours. Within days, the once stable front begins to crumble. The enemy attempts a counterattack, concentrating armor and mechanized infantry for a decisive push to crush the labyrinth-run bridgehead. But the psychology of the battlefield has changed. Their crews know that somewhere out there, unseen, is a route through their own minefield that the enemy has mastered. Every patch of ground behind them now feels suspect. As they advance, they face something they are not used to: fear of their own defenses. Ward, now coordinating with additional engineer units, turns the corridor through the labyrinth into a two-way artery. More troops and supplies flow forward. Wounded are evacuated back along the same, painstakingly maintained route. What was once a one-night gamble has become a lifeline. At higher levels, far from the mud and blood, the impact is even more profound. Strategists and staff officers pore over reports of Labyrinth Run. They realize that one of the foundational assumptions of modern fortification has just been shattered: the idea that a sufficiently dense minefield can be treated as an absolute. Because if one side, with limited resources and under pressure, can design and execute a maneuver like this, then no barrier can ever again be considered truly impenetrable. Elsewhere along the theater, other commanders begin to wonder: do our minefields look as invincible as the labyrinth once did? And if so, are we just inviting someone else to try their own impossible run? The ripples spread beyond this single front. Allied nations request detailed reports. Doctrines are reviewed. Training manuals are revised. Words like dynamic clearance, probabilistic routing, and adaptive deception begin to appear in dry official documents. Sterile phrases trying to capture something that, in reality, was anything but sterile. Men walking through the dark, each step a roll of fate, guided only by trust in a plan that sounded insane. As for the enemy, the psychological blow is harder to measure but impossible to ignore. Their troops, who once slept soundly behind the protection of layered mine belts, now lie awake, listening to distant explosions and wondering, is someone already inside? The front line, once static, now flexes and buckles. What started as a single night's crossing becomes the hinge on which an entire campaign turns. And at the center of that hinge is Labyrinth Run. The operation that proved an impossible minefield was, in the end, just another problem waiting for a mind reckless enough to solve it. What the impossible teaches us. Years later, after the smoke has cleared and the maps have been redrawn, historians will argue over the exact degree to which Labyrinth Run changed history. Some will say it was decisive, a turning point that broke a stalemate, triggered a cascade of defeats, and shortened the war. Others will call it a dramatic but ultimately localized success, one thread among many in a tangled web of causes and effects. But almost none will dispute this. It changed the way people thought. Because at its core, Labyrinth Run was not just an operation. It was a story about how humans face the word impossible. When Colonel Hale first laid out the problem, it sounded absolute, an impenetrable minefield. Time running out, no conventional solution. The doctrine said, you cannot cross this in a single night. You cannot move armor through it without months of clearance. You cannot surprise an enemy who has watched you fail again and again. But doctrine is written by people looking backward. War and life happen going forward. In that gap between what the past says is feasible and what the present demands, innovation is born. Captain Elias Ward did not make the labyrinth less dangerous. He did not magically remove the mines. He did not find a secret hidden gap that the enemy overlooked. What he did was more unsettling. He accepted the danger as a constant and changed everything around it. He redefined the problem. Instead of asking, how do we clear every mine? He asked, how do we survive enough of them to matter? Instead of trusting in a single, rigid solution, he layered multiple imperfect ones, rollers, sleds, decoys, deception, training, into a system where each component covered the weaknesses of the others. No part of Labyrinth Run was flawless. Rollers broke, sleds missed wires, decoys might have been ignored, troops could have panicked. But together, these flawed pieces created something robust enough to carry men through the most hostile terrain on the front. That is one of the enduring lessons of the labyrinth. Perfection is not required to do the impossible. Coherent audacity is. Audacity because someone has to be willing to suggest the idea that everyone else initially labels as insane. Coherence because without disciplined structure, audacity collapses into suicide. Another lesson lies in the role of deception. Labyrinth Run did not rely on raw bravery alone. It weaponized expectation. By staging a loud, doomed assault elsewhere, Ward and Hale fed the enemy exactly the story they were prepared to see. Another clumsy attempt, another predictable failure. Humans, even trained professionals, are vulnerable to narrative. We believe what fits the pattern we already know. By controlling the first story the enemy heard that night, Labyrinth Run created space for the real story to unfold in the dark. In our own lives, the minefields are usually metaphorical, systems that seem too complex to change, obstacles that feel too entrenched to cross, expectations that trap us into predictable paths. But the principle holds. If everyone around you agrees there is no way through, maybe the first step is not to attack the obstacle head-on, but to look at the mental patterns that made them certain of that in the first place. The final lesson is about courage, not the loud kind, not the kind that charges across open fields waving a flag, but the quieter version. Courage that walks forward in the dark, one measured step at a time, never totally sure the ground will hold. The men who crossed the labyrinth that night were not fearless. Far from it. They were afraid of every crunch underfoot, every hiss of cable, every distant thud of artillery. They moved anyway. Because courage, in its purest form, is not the absence of fear. It's the decision that something else matters more. For them, that something was the belief that if they succeeded, others would not have to face the same hopeless grinding stalemate they had endured for months. And they were right. Their success did not make war noble, or clean, or glorious. War remained what it always is, brutal, wasteful, a monument to failure on a grand scale. But within that darkness, Labyrinth Run stands as a small, sharp point of light, a reminder that even in the worst circumstances, human beings can still reach into the unknown and pull out something new. So when we talk about impossible feats, whether in battle, in science, in personal struggle, it is worth remembering this story. A minefield designed to be absolute, a plan everyone called suicidal, a path that existed only on a set of sketches until men walked it into reality. The labyrinth did not yield easily. It took lives. It left scars that many carried long after the last mine was cleared. But in the end, it was forced to admit a single, humbling truth. It was not a law of nature. It was just a problem. And humans, given enough pressure, enough desperation, and enough imagination, are very, very good at solving problems. What if a single suicidal gamble could rewrite the outcome of a war? On one night, in one forgotten sector, it did. And whether we're standing on a battlefield, in a workshop, in a hospital ward, or at a desk facing an empty page, the echo of that night remains. The impossible is rarely what it seems. Sometimes it's just the next problem waiting for a mind audacious enough to try.